So before we start with the actual panel, so jetzt denke ich mal, dass wir erst den Herrn Chrysanthopoulos hören, bitte. Er ist auch ein langjähriger Mitstreiter für die neue Seidenstraße und wird uns erhellen.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Helga, for the invitation to speak at the Schiller Institute. Since I'm one of the, or maybe the last speaker, I'd just like to say how impressed I was with the discussions that we had yesterday and today. And yesterday we saw the problems basically facing the internal problems of the United States and its repercussions on the Silk Road. What was very interesting was the development projects in Africa. I was quite impressed by that. And today we heard, and I will also add a little bit about the problems that the European Union is having and creating. But having gone to many conferences, I would say that the difference between the Schiller Institute conference and others is that here there are solutions that are being proposed, not only analysis. We have solutions, and if we want to implement them, we have them there to implement them. I would revert now to my speech. I'll try to make it as short as possible. But I will start by quoting my conclusion from the paper I submitted in last year's International Scientific Conference that was held in Belgrade on the initiatives of the New Silk Road. I said then, I quote, "In conclusion, if this project that is of paramount importance to humanity is to succeed, peace and stability must prevail. However, the existence and promotion of this project can also facilitate successful peace initiatives if the parties in conflict are able to understand that their benefits from their participation in the Belt and Road Initiative greatly surpass ambiguous benefits from prevailing in a conflict. Such was the experience with the Black Sea Ring Highway, where differences between some Black Sea member states were able to be softened, I will explain this further down, to the extent that the highway was allowed to pass through zones of frozen conflicts. Consequently, a successful Belt and Road Initiative is by itself an incentive for pacification. One can only imagine how Asia would be with peace in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, while perspectives that open to humanity, scientific, cultural, philosophical, spiritual aspects, with global peace prevailing, are immense. This is why the Belt and Road Initiative must succeed. I end my quote there. Also, the successful implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative could, in the long run, unite the overlapping regional organizations and initiatives in Asia in one major organization that would have its epicenter, the Belt and Road. But let me go now to expand a little bit. Some of these aspects were examined by previous speakers. The problems that the Belt and Road Initiative has to face in order to succeed. I will start first with the European Union, an organization that no longer has any contact with the people of Europe, an organization that has done away with democratic procedures, an organization that has destroyed my country, Greece. and also an organization, and we saw this in the last summit, that refuses to examine the reasons for the refugee flows and preemptively to stop them, and instead is creating an organization to block human beings running away from either from war or from economic catastrophe. Jacques Chebinade and Marco Gianni spoke in detail about that. But in Greece, the situation is disastrous. Human rights violations are happening all the time. We have gone to the criminal court in The Hague. They threw away on the issue of destruction of the health of the Greek people. It was thrown away. We're a European country. We're not an African country. We also went to the United Nations, to the Human Rights Council. The procedure there disregarded our demand to examine the human rights violations in Greece, in spite of the fact that the special representative on human rights about Greece had made two devastating reports about the situation there. Anyhow, but I'll go back to the subject. The EU does not like at all this initiative, which ends within its territory and to its benefit. In April, the EU ambassadors in Beijing issued a report that criticized the BRI since it runs counter to the EU agenda for liberalizing trade and pushes the balance of power in favor of Chinese subsidized companies. Only Hungary did not agree to the contents of that report. China has been involved in infrastructure projects in Central Europe, such as the Hungary-Serbia high-speed railway. Although Hungary allowed China to start the project, the EU stopped it because Budapest allegedly did not publish a call for public tenders and instead relied on bilateral agreements with China. This also shows the political concern of Brussels and the European business sector. Another problem created by the EU is that it does not trust state-owned enterprises, which of course occupy a large portion in China's foreign investment within the Belt and Ring Initiative, and everything possible is done to prevent their involvement. Of course, this EU policy is highly hypocritical if we take into consideration that Greece was obliged to privatize its airports by selling them to the German state-owned Fraport. One wonders what the definition of privatization is according to EU standards. I mean, we have the state-owned airports of Greece that go to a state-owned company in Germany, and this is called privatization. European protectionism is increasing, while Chinese companies are not yet fully prepared to obey the complicated regulations of the EU. So if the BRI is to succeed, a closer bilateral cooperation between the EU and China is needed so that Europe becomes once again the destination of the Silk Road. It has been said in previous and in other meetings that a potential risk for the BRI would be the eventual disintegration of the European Union, since EU funds would no longer be available. I would say the exact opposite, that the eventual dissolution of the EU would actually be a blessing, and not in disguise. Funds would be found on a bilateral basis with European countries, and the strict EU rules would no longer exist to hinder investments in European countries by state-owned companies. Furthermore, sanctions of the EU on Russia and on China would cease, thus making bilateral cooperation between the European countries with Russia and China more effective. And if Italy, the new Italian government, goes ahead with its policy of supporting Russia, then the sanctions will stop, because under EU rules, one country can block the sanctions, and there will be an amelioration of the situation. On the sanctions, just to show how detrimental they are, Russia, for example, the Russian countermeasures on the EU do not allow agricultural products from Poland to be delivered to China by the China Railway Express through the Eurasian land bridge. Anyhow, if the sanctions remain, and this will now depend on Italy, the construction of the BRI might have to face the risks of poor connectivity. However, after the last G7 meeting, which isolated the USA, the EU might take a slightly positive position towards the BRI within the framework of its reactions to the tariff war started by Washington. As Professor Christophe said in his statement, the position of the United States is important as far as the BRI is concerned. For the moment, the US position is negatively ambiguous, particularly after it withdrew last year from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. However, after the meeting with the North Korean leader, it might be helpful in this respect, but only time will tell us about that. The United States is supporting and participating in the Asian-Africa Growth Corridor, an initiative instigated by Australia, India, and Japan, and is being unsuccessfully presented as an alternative to the BRI. Of course, the USA sees China as an antagonist in the race towards global domination. And as long as it continues on that path, it will be against the BRI, in spite of the fact that the US has much to gain from it. But as long as the USA does not physically undermine the project, it may move all right. It might even strengthen the cooperation between the participating countries as a reaction to the US position. Another problem, I think, is India. India is negative because of the territorial issue that it has concerning Kashmir with Pakistan. It even calls high-level government officials of India call the BRI as an act of Chinese colonialism. The China-Pakistan economic corridor goes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. India, on her part, is promoting the India-Myanmar-Thailand Highway project, 3,200 kilometers, that will link India to ASEAN. But as I mentioned at the outset, economic benefits from a project may overcome political hesitations on conflict solving. In my experience in the Black Sea Economic Cooperation organizations, we had two cases of positive outcomes when dealing with the projected route of the Black Sea Ring Highway, a 7,500 kilometer project, highway that would unite the members of BSEC and would facilitate road transport from the Black Sea countries to Europe and Asia and vice versa. One issue was in Moldova, where the highway was to pass through the self-proclaimed Republic of Transnistria, following the old Soviet highway. The Moldovan authorities were reluctant to have the highway pass through Tiraspol. At that time, negotiations were being held between the two sides for a possible rapprochement, and the stumbling block was the issue of the new identity cards of Tiraspol. So we told Chisinau to tell the other side that if they accept the Moldovan identity cards and some other issues, then the highway would pass through them, which is what happened. The other issue was more difficult. It was between Russia and Georgia. The highway was to enter Georgia through Abkhazia, but after the August 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, the latter refused to allow the highway to enter Georgia through Abkhazia. After presenting to the Georgian side in detail the economic benefits that it would have from allowing the highway to go through its territory from Russia, we were finally able to convince Tbilisi to allow the highway to enter through the rocky tunnel in South Ossetia. The US negative position is the most important element that could hinder progress of the BRI. Efforts, bilateral, multilateral, or others, should continue to be undertaken by the participants in order to convince Washington of the benefits that it would have by participating in this project. It is almost a mission impossible, but at least it should be attempted on a permanent basis in order to avoid physical hindrance of the BRI initiative by the Americans. In this sense, closer contacts with Japan, Australia, and India to examine how the Asia-African Growth Corridor could be incorporated with the BRI project should be undertaken. With the EU, there's nothing much that can be done at the present, but follow EU rules concerning tenders and financing of projects, so EU funds can be used by the Central East European states to partially finance infrastructure projects. Hopefully, the EU might change its policy, but we shall see there. In a world where armed conflicts and violence are prevailing and international law has ceased to exist, it is important to stress the role of culture, philosophy, humanism, and spirituality. They must also be transported through the Silk Road in the form of exchange of ideas and culture between the East and the West. The Schiller Institute, through the active participation of Elga LaRouche in many international fora, is playing a very positive role in this respect. It is in this sense also that Greece held last April the first meeting of the Ancient Civilization Forum with the participation of China as well. Follow-up meetings have been held since then. In conclusion, the successful implementation of the BRI can play an instrumental role in the humanization of international relations, the economic and cultural development of populations of the participant states, and in this way, creating conditions for global peace. It might sound like a utopia, but if we don't believe in utopia, then it will never happen. Thank you.
Now here we have a young guy who comes here as a member of the Lega. If you read German media, what is the Lega? Recht-Extremist. And he didn't sound like a Recht-Extremist. He joined the Lega. I know him because he has been my friend for a couple of years. He was elected with the 5 stars. But then when he saw that the 5 stars were pushing a neoliberal agenda in the European Parliament, he had to leave. And he found the group of the Lega who told him, you can come with us, you say whatever you want, freedom of expression. And he joined the Lega only recently. But anyway, his propositional aspect is the Africa part, let's join to apply the model that Africa applies in Africa. The European Union should do this, and this is the solution to immigration. And what's wrong in saying maybe let's reflect on whether integration went too far in Europe? Because if we go on like this, either we suppress elections, or we will have a backlash, and maybe tomorrow we will have very nasty political forces taking over. So that's, I think, what he said, and I think it's a plain proposition. And what happens if we take a step back in the monetary integration, in the political integration, but we make a jump forward in physical integration, in investments and growth?
please answer Herr Hellmayer.
It's going to be short. Actually, I do not mind investment. What I do mind is consumption. What Italy still needs, and also Greece, are reforms in certain areas of the efficiency of the government, of the political standard, and of the labor markets. Otherwise, you know, the point is, what I want to make is, Italy used to devalue, for instance, like Greece used to devalue in former times. That is non-structural. If you devalue, you have higher inflation. If you have higher inflation, you don't get capital formation, capital investment, because the risk of high inflation is eating up the value of the... Thus, you betray the young generation of their future. The neglect of political reforms is the prerequisite for the youth problems in the labor market in most of the southern regions. And what we are seeing now is, yes, in order to have the reforms, if you implement the reforms, you cut off cold flash, which is non-productive of an economy, which is painful. You have higher unemployment. But after that, you have a better allocation of all production factors, and then you have sustainable growth again. Any other issue is betraying yourself. And we need to do something about deficits. You're right about the net borrowing position of Italy is even better than Germany if you look at private households plus government. But that's not the point. The point is to achieve a sustainable official budget. Otherwise, markets will punish you. And without the solidarity of Europe, Italy would have gone bankrupt in 2012. It took whatever it takes by Mario Draghi, and you know that very well. And that is betraying your country. In the end, we need to stick to certain rules. That was the gold standard. You were forced to stick to rules. And we had lots of nectar of the new system where we could run budget deficits like hell. And what you did in Italy and what Greece did wrong, after getting the euro, getting a low interest rate level, you consumed it away, you didn't invest it. I'm very much in favor of investment on infrastructure. I don't mind running debts on capital investment. I agree with you there. But there should be a genuine understanding that the European family stood together in this crisis, and without standing together, this would have been a recession like 1929-32, not only Europe, but for the rest of the world, because of the interconnectedness. That's what we should understand also. And there's one more issue I want to make, and this is really a strong mark. The US and the UK has repeated after the crisis 2008-9, the business model that generated the crisis. It's all debt. It's the highest consumer debt, it's the highest corporate debt, and they run a 2.5% growth model with budget deficits of 5.3% this year of GDP if you rely on IMF. The Eurozone stands at 0.6% this year, IMF numbers, budget deficit with more than 2% growth, and it's recurring income, not credit, which is driving this growth. And this is good, and this is structural policy, this is reform policy, this is Aristotle, this is future. Thank you.
Yes, I would just like to reply that I totally disagree with you, Mr. Hellmayer, as far as Greece is concerned. I mean, we had an 8-year program of reforms that destroyed the country. You cannot kill a country in order to have some GNPs and all that. So many people have died. We had human losses in this thing. The economy has been destroyed. Nothing works in Greece anymore. And this is presented as a success. Plus, let's go, this is something else that you don't know about, of course. We have another problem, another issue, which is the German debt towards Greece on the loan that Germany made during the Greek occupation, which is worth today its value is much bigger than the Greek debt. But that's another story. I mean, that concerns the Greek governments, the Quisling governments, who refused to raise the issue with Germany and who still do refuse that. But we started the program, and actually the program of reforms was to diminish the debt of Greece, which was in 2010, 120% of the GDP, and today it's 185. So it's 8 years of failure, and there's nobody in the EU to take responsibility about this failure. Even the IMF said that we failed, and the politicians refused to change that policy because they refuse to admit that they made a mistake. I cannot, and many Greeks can no longer tolerate to see their country being destroyed like that by the EU, of which we are members. I won't continue, thank you.